So in this video, I'll tell you why former university student Matthew Hyde was sentenced to 15 years and 7 months for offenses relating to his torturing a young woman in his dorm room at the university for 3 days. Do you think the sentence is appropriate? Too high? Too low? Hold on. Watch the video first and tell me at the end. Comment below, alright? Thank you so much for joining me courtside. I'm Dionne Jackson Miller. Stay tuned. So again, I'm going to say what a horrible story this is, right? Matthew Hyde was a second-year student at the University of the West Indies Mona campus. He held his former girlfriend captive in his room, as I said, for 3 days, torturing her by burning her with a clothes iron. And if you missed part 1 of the video, you can check it out. I'll link it below and at the end because I go through what happened in that part of the video. In this video, I'm going to be talking about his sentencing. Now, he had pleaded guilty to assault occasioning, meaning causing actual bodily harm, false imprisonment, malicious communication, and 4 counts of causing grievous bodily harm. That's really serious harm. And I'm going to explain, as I said, the sentencing. First of all, there are 4 main aims to sentencing: retribution for what was done, deterrence, trying to deter other people from doing the same thing, preventing it from happening, as well as rehabilitation. And the sentencing process involves the judge deciding first of all on a starting point for the sentence. Then the judge will look at aggravating factors that would worsen what happened and could therefore make the sentence longer, as well as mitigating factors that would go to make the sentence lighter. So think of a pair of scales. The starting point is the middle of the scale, and then the aggravating factors, now you pile on one side and you pile the mitigating factors on the other side, and you see at the end of the day whether the sentence gets longer or shorter. Now, what the sentencing guidelines for judges says is that in arriving at an appropriate starting point in a case, the judge has to assess the seriousness of the offense, take into account how culpable the offender was in committing the particular offense, as well as looking at the harm that has been caused by the offense. So the judge now, the sentencing judge, says she took into account the facts in relation to the offense. She says she took into account the information she got from the social inquiry report. That's when a probation officer goes out and talks to people who knew the accused person and ask them what kind of person he is. He stay, him do things like this before. What him as a good person or a bad person. And then she talks to the person himself as well, the accused person as well. The judge also takes into account the antecedent report. This is a report that's going to tell her if the person has previously been in trouble, has previously had any convictions, perhaps is what I should say. So the judge took into account a number of considerations, which I'll come to a little bit later on so that I don't do too much repetition, right? She says she also took into account the objectives of sentencing that I went through a little bit earlier on. And she said she considered all the options available, including the possibility of a non-custodial option, meaning whether it would be appropriate for him not to be sent to prison at all, but to be put on, for instance, probation. And she said that is the first resort that you look at, a non-custodial option. So I'm just going to look in detail at how she sentenced on the most serious offense of grievous bodily harm with intent to maim the young lady in question, and he pleaded guilty to 4 counts of that offense, which, as I said, carries the highest penalty. Now, the maximum sentence for this offense is life imprisonment, but the judge said straight up that the maximum sentence is reserved for the worst examples of a particular offense. And she said even though the facts in this case were horrific, it wasn't the worst type of injury, so life imprisonment wouldn't be the appropriate sentence here. Now, stop a moment, because I know that you've, having heard the facts, you probably want to boil him in oil in the town square, and you're saying, no man, a prison must go for life and all kind of things. No doubt, because it is a horrific case. But again, you have to remember that sentencing has an element of proportionality, right? The more serious a case is, the more serious the circumstances are, then you go towards the heavier end of the sentencing spectrum. And you can't go heavy and maximum for everything, because then you take out that issue of proportionality. How do you then say we are sentencing you to a longer period because what you did was more serious than what the other person did? So you can't go for a maximum sentence on everything, right? And remember, the judge has the experience, not just his or her own experience, but also the benefit of other cases that have been tried and sentenced before the courts, so they can look at other cases and the facts of other cases. So that's how she's able to say this is not the worst type of this particular offense. The judge also looked at the medical reports in relation to the matter, right? She did say there was some difficulty in finding suitable cases that she could use for comparison because of what she called the unusual features of this case, the branding element. That's what he did to her with the iron, when he burned her with the iron and left the scars that looked like the back of the iron, the branding element, she called it, or she said torture, the element of torture, as this case could be called. Now, the defense had been suggesting that an appropriate sentence would be 3 to 4 years, but the judge said, no, not in this case. So the starting point now, remember, what the judge needs to do is identify the starting point, look at the aggravating factors, look at the mitigating factors. She then needs to look at whether the sentence should be reduced, and if so, by how much, because Hyde in this case pleaded guilty, and then give credit for time already served, time he has already been in custody. Our judges have something called the sentencing guidelines to help them, and these have ranges within which a sentence should be handed down. So let's look at what the sentencing guidelines says for this particular offense, causing grievous bodily harm with intent. The sentencing guidelines say that the sentence range for this offense is between 5 and 20 years, which is pretty wide, with a usual starting point of 7 years. So they give the range, and then based on the circumstances of the case, the judge uses his or her discretion to decide where you come down. So the usual starting point is 7 years. And deciding on the starting point now, the judge said she looked at what the accused did. She looked at the cruelty, the callousness, the brutality that he meted out to the young woman, coupled with the excruciating pain that the young woman suffered. And she said all of that put together justifies a higher starting point than the 7 years. So she said 12 years is the appropriate starting point in this case instead of the usual 7. Then now she looked at aggravating features, the fact that intimate partner violence is prevalent in Jamaican society, that there was a breach of trust. The complainant came to his room, he was asking her questions and say, no man, if you tell the truth, everything will be okay. And then it wasn't. The judge looked at the element of premeditation, right? That he had to plug in the iron, wait for it to heat up, and then burn her. And she looked at the fact that the burns weren't inflicted at the same time. He burned her over a period of time. He burned her, then he, threw cold water on the burns and put burn cream on her, and then he would burn her again. And the judge said this was a significant feature of the case and made it different from some of the other cases in the past. So for instance, the kind of acid attack cases, we used to have a fair amount of those, where somebody would throw acid on somebody else, but you see, you throw the acid one time and it's done. She said this time what you had was the pain being inflicted over a period of time. The judge looked at the fact that the young woman's pain would have been obvious and palpable throughout the ordeal, but that he continued burning her. She looked at the fact that burning involves close contact and proximity, Also, the number of burns that the complainant had received. Her buttocks were burnt on each cheek. Her breasts were burnt. Her right, her left jaw, her nose, her forehead, both sides of her back. The judge made the point that the number of burns received is a different factor from the fact that those burns were inflicted over a period of time. She looked at the placement of the burns. She said the accused had told the probation officer that he wasn't being deliberate in terms of where he burned the young lady, but the judge said he burned her in areas that went to her femininity, as if he was trying to make her unattractive for anyone else in the future. The judge said the fact that he burned on her face after threatening to do so and her begging, please don't, and he still went ahead and burned her, showed that he was acting deliberately. She looked at his behavior, his apparent desire to punish the complainant, the fact that he jeered at her, he taunted her. So for instance, after burning her, he told her to stand up so he could appreciate his artwork, that he told her after burning her that thank you is in order from her. The judge said this was a significant aggravating feature. Then she looked at the physical and the psychological pain that the complainant suffered, that the impact was going to be lasting, that the physical scars will be a constant reminder, and that there are also psychological, non-physical scars. In the victim impact statement, the young lady spoke about how she suffered during the ordeal, how she thought she was going to die, and how she is still suffering. The judge also looked at what the trauma did not just to her, but to her entire family. The financial toll it's taken on the family, the fact that her mother had to quit her job to stay home and help take care of her, that the injection she needed for the scarring had to stop when her father ran into problems with his job. And the judge said all of those aggravating factors weren't moving the starting point. So remember, she had said the starting point instead of 7, the usual 7 was going to be 12. Then she looked at all these aggravating factors and she said because of all these factors, the starting point now moves to 20. But she treated the count related to the burns on the young woman's face differently. The judge said he burned her face after threatening to do so. And the judge said a person's face plays a critical role in their identity. She said it's abhorrent to disfigure somebody's face, especially a woman. And she said the complainant spoke about how she couldn't bear to look at herself in the mirror. She would turn away from mirrors, how she was trying to use makeup to cover up the scarring. And based off all of that, the judge moved the starting point for that count from the initial 12 to 22 years. Then now she looked at the mitigating factors. So will the mitigating factors move the number of years, move the sentence down? Well, these were the mitigating factors. She looked at his youth. He was 20 at the time he committed the offense, 22 at the point of sentencing. Now, youth is usually a strong mitigating factor because it speaks to somebody's capacity for rehabilitation and reform. The judge said, though, his age has to be looked at in context. She said he was somewhat exposed. He was a second-year university student. He was also working and earning money. And she said that, therefore, she wasn't going to place much weight on his youth. Another mitigating factor, he had no previous convictions. He also had a history of psychiatric treatment, persistent depressive disorder, depressive episodes. And the reason this is a mitigating factor is that it can indicate that the person has a lower moral culpability than somebody who isn't suffering from those mental health issues. But the psychiatrist who assessed him said he wasn't suffering from an abnormality of mind, meaning there wasn't an issue in terms of him not being able to take mental responsibility for what he was doing. No. On the issue of his character, was he of good character? That's a mitigating factor, but there was mixed evidence here. A former girlfriend said he was loving and caring. The resident advisor on his hall said he got on well with others. He was a good resident. But there was evidence that there had been some kind of physical altercation with his grandmother that had led to her having to seek medical treatment, and that is why he was living on hall, as well as one family member who said they thought he needed to be locked up because he needed to understand that what he was doing wasn't okay. So the judge said he can't generally be regarded as being of good character, and she said she wasn't going to place much weight on that factor. Now, remorse is also a mitigating factor. Now, a relative had said he didn't seem to be showing much remorse. His lawyer said he was remorseful. He told the probation officer who interviewed him that he hoped the complainant would forgive him. And he told the psychiatrist about a year after the event occurred that he was sorry for what he did. The judge, though, said those expressions of remorse came sometime after the fact and wouldn't be as significant as if he had earlier on said he was sorry. The judge then looked at restitution, that his family paid the young woman $2 million. The judge said, well, she didn't know how much it was going to take for her physical and psychiatric treatment going forward, but that $2 million wasn't a huge sum given the fact that she's going to need plastic surgery, she's going to need ongoing psychiatric treatment. And she said it's also important to realize that restitution, paying over money, doesn't expunge an offense, doesn't wipe it out, because otherwise people would think they can do anything and then just pay off some money and get off. And the judge said, no, that's how it works. The probation officer said he was assessed as low risk to society, but moderate risk to people close to him. The psychiatrist said his violence risk was low. So for all the mitigating factors, no, the court took all of that together, and for all of that, she took off 3 years and 6 months. So looking at the heaviest sentence, which remember, started at 12 years as a starting point, then the judge pushed it up to 22 years because of the aggravating factors. So the judge is now going to take off 3 years and 6 months, and that brings us down to 18 years and 6 months because the aggravating factors outweighed the mitigating factors. Now, he had pleaded guilty, and by law, if you plead guilty, you may get a discount, a reduction on your sentence of up to 50%. So theoretically, you can get a reduction from, say, an 18-year sentence to one that can come down to about 9 years. But it's an issue of discretion for the court. It's a discretion for the judge. Now, people always want to know why when you plead guilty you get something off on your sentence. That's because in doing so, you have saved the court a lot of time, you've saved expense, you've saved everybody a lot of trouble, and importantly, the complainant, especially in a case like this, which is such a distressing case, what you've done now is that he has saved the complainant from having to come and endure a trial with all the trauma that would be. She would have to testify, she would have to be cross-examined, and the whole thing again would be very traumatic. So pleading guilty is something that is going to go to reduce your sentence. But in the circumstances of this case, the judge said a 50% reduction was not appropriate, and that a 15% reduction was appropriate in the case. She also, in making that decision, she had to look at whether the punishment fit the crime, and importantly, she had to look at what would be the reaction of the public. Would society be outraged? Would the conscience of the public be shocked to hear that in a case like this, the person got a 50% reduction on their sentence? So she said, taking all that into account, she was giving a 15% reduction. So that now, remember, we're at 18 years and 6 months after the aggravating factors, after the mitigating factors, and the reduction of 15% now takes a sentence to 15 years and 7 months. So that was a sentence. But you still can't stop there, because you have to look at the time that he spent in custody, which was 1 year and 10 months. And the reason you have to do that is that if he is in custody 1 year, 10 months, and then he serves a full sentence of 15 years, 7 months, that means he would end up doing longer in custody than the sentence was. And that is not something that would be right. So you now take the 15 years and 7 months, which is a sentence, and you subtract from it the time he has spent in custody. That's 1 year and 10 months. And now you get to your figure of 13 years and 9 months, which is the time he has left to serve. Don't confuse it though. The sentence is different from the time left to serve, all right? Now, I'm not going to go through the details of the sentencing on the other counts, except to say he was sentenced to 14 years. On the other counts of grievous bodily harm with intent, all of this is before we start subtracting for the time served, all right? He was sentenced to 5 years and 9 months on the count of malicious communication, and the sentences for false imprisonment and assault occasioning actual bodily harm actually were less than the 1 year 10 months that he had already been in custody. So those sentences have already been served. Now, all the sentences that are left to serve will run concurrently, meaning they're running together at the same time, not one after the other, after the other, after the other. And the reason for that is that all the offenses were charged based on the same set of events. The judge said, in coming to that final sentence, the final sentences, the judge said she looked at whether the sentence was appropriate, right? She said she decided it was proportionate to the seriousness of what had been done, that it would punish him, but also deter anybody else who might be thinking of doing the same thing. And at the same time, it would allow him to return to society when he's still relatively young enough to still be a productive member of society. She said what had been done in this case was horrifying. She said people who behave like this must expect to pay with significant periods of imprisonment. But at the same time, she made a point of saying Hyde is to be given appropriate psychiatric treatment in prison to try to address the underlying problems so something like this don't happen again. So is an appeal likely or possible? Well, maybe I should say a successful appeal, because as I mentioned earlier, his lawyer was asking for 3 to 4 years. The judge said that wasn't appropriate. If he appeals, I actually could see some time being knocked off the sentence, especially because of the issue of his youth. I really don't think the judge gave his youth appropriate weight in coming to the sentence. The issue of the mental health, some of my colleagues are saying they think that should be a big issue that would also serve to knock down the sentence. I'm in two minds about that, because yeah, the mental health issues do seem to have been significant, but you have lots of people who have, for instance, depression, who don't go around torturing people. Also, importantly, the doctor said he wasn't having any abnormality of mind. That is, that his mental responsibility for what he was doing wasn't negatively affected. What a story, man. I want to end by saying my heart really goes out to this really brave young woman and her family. Just imagine if this was something you had to go through, or your daughter or your sister, just how horrible it would be for everybody involved, you know. And I wish for her complete healing and recovery, and that she is able to go on to love again, to trust again. I can only imagine how difficult that is going to be. And in fact, the judge actually said to her that she should not let this issue define her, and that to remember that healing is a journey. So now that you've heard everything, what do you think of the sentence? What do you think of the sentencing process? Do drop your comments below. Always want to hear from you. I'm Dionne. Thank you so much for being here with me courtside. I'll see you next time.